A warm welcome to you and thank you very much for watching Africa Speaks on Pan-African Television. I am your host Rashida Abubakar. Tonight, we ask an important question. Why does a continent so rich in land, minerals and human potential continue to struggle with conflict and hunger? From the fight against terrorism in Mali to growing political tensions in DR Congo, we examine the forces shaping Africa today. We also explore what the IMF has been doing to the continent and why hunger continues to spread across the continent. We will hear from workers and peasants movements on the question of hunger, celebrate a labor victory in South Africa, and remember one of Africa's greatest voices of resistance, Fela Kuti. Stay with us, there's much more to come. Let's start with our spotlight segment where we look at two issues. In Mali, where the military continues its operations against armed groups threatening the country's security. For many Malians, the struggle is not only about defeating terrorism, but about protecting national sovereignty and restoring peace. In the DRC, public anger continues to build up against the president's plan to get elected for a third term, despite it being against the constitution. Over to Daniel Otu Asante for more.
Welcome to Spotlight, the segment where we examine Africa's defining issues through an African lens. Our first story is from Mali, its continuing fight against terrorism and what it means for sovereignty and security in the Sahel. For more than a decade, Mali has remained at the front line of Africa's struggle against terrorism. Today, the country's armed forces continue to confront coordinated attacks by jihadist groups and separatist fighters determined to destabilize the Sahel. Recent offensives have targeted military positions across northern and central Mali, prompting renewed counter-offensives by the Malian armed forces and their regional allies. Last month, Malian forces were able to break out of a major ambush by militant groups following an attack on a military convoy. The attack was conducted by the coalition involving Jamaat al-Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin Jenim, an al-Qaeda-affiliated armed group, and the Front de Libération de l'Azawad, FLA. And the two groups have been continuously trying to destabilize the country, with the Jenin imposing months-long blockade of the capital, Bamako. The crisis in Mali cannot be understood without examining its historical roots. Years of foreign military interventions, the NATO-engineered collapse of Libya in 2011, and the proliferation of armed groups have left the Sahel vulnerable to instability. Mali's military authorities maintain that restoring national sovereignty and defeating terrorism are inseparable goals, along with Burkina Faso and Niger, its allies in the alliance of the Sahel state. Mali continues to emphasize African-led security cooperation over external military dependence. The defense of the country has also been strengthened by thousands of Malians who have regularly expressed support for the government's efforts to defend its sovereignty. The question of these attacks is also linked to the role of France. Mali and its allies have made it clear that France is supporting these groups after having been kicked out of the Sahel. After a series of military coups, Mali is on the front lines of battle for sovereignty, and the question before it are for the entire continent. Can the patriotic forces of Africa work together to ensure the defeat of the forces of destabilization, which are often backed by imperialist terrorists? Our next story is from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where uncertainty prevails over the question of a third term for President Felix Tshisekedi. In recent times, massive protests took place against the president's plan to modify the constitution, leading to a political deadlock. The crisis intensified after Parliament formalized a framework for constitutional referendum. Meanwhile, the Senate also approved a reform that could remove the two-term limit of the presidency. That led to mass protests with a number of opposition parties combining to form a political platform called C64. Protests in the second week of June saw violent clashes. The protests were set to intensify in July, but were called off after a mediation offer by the African Union. The dialogue is set to be held in August 15 and will be led by religious groups. However, opposition parties have warned that protests will intensify if talks are not held. These developments expose the dual crisis in the Congo. For decades, the country has faced assaults by rebel groups backed by Rwanda and Uganda, which have led to the death of millions. These attacks aim to loot the mineral wealth of the country. At the same time, the country's ruling class have failed to seek justice for its people or exercise sovereignty over its natural resources. Instead, it has sought to sell them for political benefits. President Tshisekedi first came to power through underhand agreements mediated by foreign powers. Today, he sells the country's mineral wealth to the US by passing laws. However, this is not a question for one individual or one election alone. The Democratic Republic of Congo is one of Africa's richest countries in natural resources, yet millions continue to face poverty, displacement, and insecurity. The search is for a political and social project that sees through sovereignty and security and places the people of Congo before extractivism and corruption. This has been the Spotlight on Africa Speaks with me, Danny Ochuesante. Thank you for watching. Join us next time as we continue to tell the African story the African way.
We now move to our Expert Speaks segment where we ask simple questions. Why have African governments surrendered their decisions to the IMF? The IMF has been advising African governments for decades, but all they seem to do is more debt and less growth. But somehow, our government keeps going back to the IMF. To understand this, we will be talking to Grieve Shelwa, who is the Chair, Department of Social Science and Associate Professor of Political Economy at the Africa Institute. He is also the Senior Fellow at Tricontinental Institute of Social Research. Shelwa and Vijay Prashant have released a book called How International Monetary Fund Strangles Africa. So he is indeed the best person to speak to this about. Let's hear what he has to say.
Well, you're welcome on Africa Speaks, and this is our Expert Speaks segment on Africa Speaks this evening. You're welcome, Professor Chelua, to Pan-African Television. So this week we are talking about why African governments have surrendered their decisions to the IMF. We tend to go to the IMF so many times to solve our problems. We go for monetary aid and all that, and then in relation to that, we are being placed with some austerity measures and all that goes a long way to harm us rather than do us any good. And today's discussion is going to be centered around that. But first, I want to ask you, could you first broadly tell us a bit about how the IMF has approached African countries and what kind of suggestions have they given African economies?
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be on this program and for availing me and my co-author, Professor Vijay Prashad, an opportunity to talk about our forthcoming book, How the International Monetary Fund Strangles Africa. And you're very right. There is no other continent in the world that goes to the IMF as much as African countries do, and with very little to show for it, right? So we are the ones who are the biggest friends of the International Monetary Fund, and yet we continue to be the poorest continent in the world. So that certainly, there's something wrong there, right? And one then is led to conclude that the International Monetary Fund must be one of the causes of this underdevelopment, of this poverty.
Yeah.
So we tend to go to the IMF a great deal. I mean, there's one statistic that says an African country goes to the IMF once every 5 years. Ghana has gone to the IMF over 20 times. Senegal has done the same. Kenya has done the same. Zambia has done the same. So we go to the IMF so many times, and essentially the IMF has to be seen as a creature of Western Empire. It's very important for people to understand this. And the IMF was born in 1944 at a conference that was convened by the United States and Great Britain, called the Bretton Woods Conference. And the architects of the IMF were very clear in assigning or ascribing the IMF the task of being an agent of Western Empire, right? So it's not then therefore surprising that the policies that the IMF forces African governments to implement are those kinds of policies that advance the interest of Western Empire, right? So policies like austerity, which essentially results in the weakening of the African state, that results in the incapacitation of the African state. And I think we can go into much more detail in this dialogue, Victoria.
Right.
Right, so yeah, exactly.
Yes, you see, you were talking about the fact that we go to the IMF, but our problems are not being solved. We hear a lot about debts. We know the question about debts, and it's very important in Africa because every day when we turn on our TVs, even in our own various countries, we hear, oh, the government is owing this amount of money to the IMF and all that. Do you think that the IMF policy have contributed to this?
Yes, they have a great deal, right? So essentially, we have to understand why it is that African governments borrow in the first place, right? Your own first president, the great redeemer, Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, in his magisterial text of 1964, 1965, Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism, did something very fascinating in that text, something that hasn't been done since he wrote it. He basically did an accounting of trying to understand the wealth that Africa has. And in his book, he was able to establish there is no other continent in the world that is as wealthy as Africa in terms of natural resources, in terms of human resources, right? So
Right.
there is no reason why we should be borrowing if we have all these resources at our disposal. But
Mm,
what turns out is that the IMF forces our governments to implement the kind of policies
right.
that force our governments to turn a blind eye on those resources. Stated differently, what the IMF does is that it doesn't want us to have sovereignty over our natural resources, right? So what you tend to find in many African countries, Ghana not being an exception, Zambia not being an exception, go around all the other countries of the continent, you will find that that natural resource which Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah was able to establish as the wealth of the continent is often in the hands of foreign multinationals, right? Therefore, depriving our governments of the much needed revenues to be able to finance development. So, given this scenario that we have no sovereignty of our natural resources, mostly as a result of IMF advice, we then end up in a situation where we're very rich natural resources, yet very poor, therefore exposing ourselves
Mm,
to debt.
mm,
And then once we get into debt, right, and mostly we are in debt, we get into debt. The ones who indebt us are the ones who were erstwhile colonizers, which was a point that Thomas Sankara made in 1987 at the OAU. Then we are open up to a policy in debt. So once we are indebted, then the ground is set for the IMF to come back again,
right. Right.
right, to come and then advise us. So it's like a very vicious cycle,
Mm.
right, whereby we have no control of our natural resources because of IMF policy. Therefore, we borrow. Because we borrow, then we expose ourselves to interference from the IMF. So it's this vicious cycle that we need to disrupt.
Right. So this particular vicious cycle does not really solve our problem. For example, Ghana, for instance, has gone to the IMF about 18 or over 18 times, and we keep going back without getting concrete solutions to our problems. Do you think that African governments could shy away from this particular IMF policies and the monies they give in quotes, more like to help us, but not really helping us? Do you think that the African governments could shy away from that? What are there alternatives to these policies that African governments should shy away from? And why are we not, shying away from these policies that do not concretely solve the problems of our people?
I mean, you're very right. It's very possible, right? Again, I like to think about the historical parallel of colonization, right? So imagine Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia, Nyerere in Tanzania, Amilcar Cabral, Samora Machel, Ahmed Sékou Touré in Guinea, right? In the lead up to the 60s or 70s, right? You know, there were some people who probably were making the argument there's no alternative to colonization.
Mm.
You just, the best possible world for you is to have Westerners run your affairs directly via colonization, right? And somebody might have posed the question, and I'm sure these leaders that I mentioned did pose the question, is an alternative possible? The answer is yes. It is very possible for us to do things differently away from the International Monetary Fund. And for a while after independence, many African countries did do things on their own and did not need the IMF at all, right? So there are many examples of countries which were internally dependent on themselves, right? Zambia, which is a country that I am from and a country that I know very well, from 1964 up until 1991, we hardly had any such significant interactions with the IMF. In fact, famously, our first president, Kenneth Kaunda, in the 1980s, chased the IMF away. And one of the cardinal reasons why we could be able to do that was, again, establishing sovereignty of our natural resources.
Right.
It's very, very important to
Mm.
establish that sovereignty on your natural resources because once you do that, then you'll be able to collect, to mobilize resources domestically, right? Because we have to understand where African governments borrow. They're borrowing, like I said before, because they've got to develop, but they don't have the resources. And they don't have the resources because they don't have sovereignty over natural resources, right? So the first step is really to establish sovereignty over natural resources, and then the rest will follow completely thereafter. And in African history, there have been examples of policy proposals that very clearly articulate a different type of world that is completely different to what the IMF wants us to do. For example, in 1980, the great distinguished Nigerian economist Adebayo Adedeji did propose the Lagos Plan of Action. So he was the architect of the Lagos Plan of Action, which was a product of the Organization of African Unity and the Economic Commission for Africa. And this particular blueprint document was very, very clear in
Right.
how you could establish a different type of economy
Mm.
that is not dependent on the IMF. So we have these blueprints, but the very important thing, the most important thing we've got to do is establish sovereignty of our natural resources. Yeah.
Right. It is very important that we establish sovereignty of our natural resources. Now, I want to narrow this down a bit. Now, Africa sits as the highest in terms of having hungry people in the world, in the whole world. What do you think a government can do to tackle this? Actually, we sit at a place where we have the natural resources, we have the most resources that we can think of, but yet our people go hungry. People cannot even afford one square meal per day. What do you think is the way forward?
I mean, the that's a shaming statistic again, right? An incredible shaming statistic. Again, in spite of all these interactions with the IMF, and every time that the IMF comes to town, they'll always tell you that this time around, this is the plan that will turn Ghana around. This
Right.
is the plan that will turn Zambia around. This is the plan that will turn Kenya around, so on and so forth. And yet, the same thing does happen, right? It's almost like what Albert Einstein said about madness. Madness is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, right? And this is really a scar on our conscience, the very fact that we're the most hungry continent. And yet, we have some of the most fertile land in the world. We have some of the most amazing rivers in the world. We've got some of the most hospitable climates in the world insofar as agriculture is concerned. And we have the youngest population,
Yeah.
right, of people that can work the land and till the land and grow the food. So again, this is a scar on our conscience. And when people talk about development, people say to me, what is development? Somebody may come up with a very technical definition of what development is, but for me, development really is dignity, right? Bestowing dignity on people. And if people are hungry, people don't have dignity. So basically, to answer your question is we've neglected the agrarian question in Africa, the
Mm.
question about agriculture, right? So we've got to get agriculture going again.
Right.
And we got to get agriculture going again by giving our peasant farmers, by
Mm.
giving our farmers the necessary implements and inputs for them to be able to work the land. And the only way you do that is to give agricultural subsidies. But this is the language that the IMF doesn't like. The first thing that they do when they come into town is they want you to get rid of your agricultural subsidy
Right.
because they don't want you to feed yourself. And as Thomas Sankara famously said, he
They
who feeds you
you control.
controls you.
Exactly.
Yes. So that's precisely it. So we've got to be able to get our agriculture policy right. The first step is certainly to give our farmers the necessary implements and inputs via a subsidy program. We have to give them the factors of production, the inputs of production, so that they can begin to grow their actual agriculture production. And this has happened before in history. In those times, in those countries where the government has given peasant farmers priority, has privileged them in agriculture policy, those countries have seen an increase in the production of food. And then there are other things around research and development. We need to again boost our universities, our high institutes of learning, our high institutes of research, so that they can be able to research the soil, research the crops, right, and those kinds of things. And the combination of that technical knowledge with the combination of supporting our peasant farmers should get us to a point where we're no longer the hungriest continent in the world, which is a
Right.
shameful thing for us to be talking about almost 60 years, since many of us got independence. It's a scar on our conscience, and I think it is something that should shame our leaders. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Chelwa, for having you. We are glad having you. We understand that there's a need for us as Africans to shy away from these IMF policies and its austerity measures, which would not, at the long run, bring us any good and will continue to impoverish our people and our continent as a whole. We thank you very much for having you.
Thank you for the opportunity. Very, very, very glad to be here.
Right. Okay.
You're still watching Africa Speaks on Pan-African Television. We just heard about how Africa now has the highest number of hungry people in the world. In our Voices on the Ground section, we hear from those working closest to the people to combat hunger and ensure food sovereignty.
So when we talk about hunger and food insecurity in Ghana, we must understand that we are not only talking about whether food is being produced in Ghana or not. In fact, we are also fundamentally talking about access, affordability, distribution, and the priorities of our economic system. Because Ghana as a nation has the land, the farmers, and the capacity to produce enough food to feed its people. But yet we find a lot of working class families struggling to afford basic needs like food. At the same time, farmers face rising input costs, limited access to credit, inadequate irrigation, storage, processing, and transportation facilities. So from our perspective, government policy play a significant role. We have not invested sufficiently in agriculture, particularly supporting smallholder farmers, while our dependence on imported food continues. We also lose a significant amount of locally produced food because of weak storage and processing systems. So the question we should be asking is, who is our economy designed to serve? Is it the lay Ghanaian? Is it the working class people, or the multinational companies that only think of or only care about profit? So if our economy if our economic policies prioritize profit over the needs of ordinary people, then hunger will continue even when there is enough food in the country. So from the perspective of the socialist movement of Ghana, food security must become a national priority. Government must invest more in agriculture, provide farmers with affordable inputs and credit, expand irrigation and extension services, and develop storage and processing facilities. We also need policies that strengthen local food production and reduce excessive dependence on imports. Farmers should be supported also to organize cooperatives so that they can reduce costs, share resources, and have greater bargaining power. Communities too can strengthen local food systems and support initiatives that connect farmers directly with consumers. So ultimately, hunger is not inevitable in Ghana. Ghana has the resources and the human capacity to feed its people. What we need is the political will and an economic system that puts the needs of the majority above private profit. So for us in the socialist movement of Ghana, food is not simply a commodity. It is a basic human right. Our goal must be a Ghana where farmers live with dignity, people can afford nutritious food, and no Ghanaian goes hungry.
And now to our dispatches. We begin with Swaziland, which will see extremely controversial annual Umhlanga Reed dance on August 25th. During this festival, young women and girls are made to dance bare-breasted and paraded before King Swati III so he can choose a wife. People's movements in Swaziland have been up and arm against this barbaric ritual, which represents impunity of Africa's last absolute monarch. We hear from them.
Thank you very much. Umhlanga Reed dance, it's one and some amongst the many other so-called cultural events that are organized by the monarch in Swaziland. I will illustrate that it is an old Ngoni tradition that women or young girls could be assembled, but preserving their status, and then speaking more about the education of women and how women should grow and how they should be actually nurtured. But under the current system, it is a tool of oppression, and it is also a tool of subjugation and exploitation of women. In what sense? In the sense that this kind of an event is actually organized to make sure that it portrays the monarchy as part and parcel of the identity of the Swazi people. Yet, in actual fact, the monarchy as an absolute monarch is a political system that has historically imposed its authority over the Swazi people. And the women of our country, like the young girls, are then mobilized and paraded in front of the monarchy and also the friends of the monarchy. The purpose of doing so is actually to reach and achieve a tranquility on the status of men in society, in the Swazi society under the monarchy, that they see women and value women as objects for their own evaluation. The women, the young girls are being paraded and they are defined on strict code of dress code so that they are actually exposed to be what they are for the purposes of those who are in charge of the state could, as part and parcel of their gift, could actually identify whom they think they can be their objects or they can be their sexual objects for their future enjoyment as part and parcel of the state. So it is one another an event, a gathering that is assembled by the royal family to parade and demonstrate that it has got authority over the Swazi people. And that's why the movement in the country rejects that, because first and foremost, it is labor that is being mobilized. These young girls do not just simply go and dance. They coordinate ready dance, which is part and parcel of an instrument of decoration for the royal households. They must collect it at free labor, for that matter, at free labor. And then as it is done, they are actually used and made to be subjected, that they must think that they are part and parcel of what the culture should have been. So being a culture meaning, therefore, that they should be the most obedient people to the monarch. So the culture in Swaziland is about obedience to the monarch. Not to forget that this is a system that doesn't actually enjoy any support from the people, but it imposes itself to the people. And therefore, any true culture will mean the people should freely participate and they fully assimilate their own abilities. But in this case, they are being hoodwinked and they're being subjected to this kind of a phenomenon whereby they must never think of anything about themselves, but they should, about themselves meaning about their education, about their livelihood, and about how the country actually has for them in future. But they must then think that their only existence is to actually to serve the monarchy. And that's why it is a part and parcel of the tool of operation. That's how the Communist Party and the movement in the country actually explains this kind of a phenomenon. And that's why we object and then call upon the people of Swaziland to reject this, and the world also to recognize that this is actually an uncalled for and it is not worth to be recognized. As an absolute monarchy, from 1973, they promulgated the constitution that has allowed political parties to also to be part and parcel of the political system. And then it rendered all power, the 1973 decree rendered all power to the monarchy. That is why from 1973, there's been an absolute monarchy. And for all the years until 2005, there was no constitution. The king himself is the master of all laws in the country. And even after 2005, the new constitution also didn't change anything. But instead, it started actually to connect and patch the monarchy in the modern world system. But it never changed anything. There's an absolute monarchy that controls the land. All the land in the country is under the absolute monarch. All natural resources in the country are under the absolute monarch. They control even the entire wealth of the country in the basis that they have also established an economic facility that makes sure that they can, in any case, any business that is running in the country, any economic activity in the country through TBO fund, they must make sure that they have full control of the resources. And all those assets are exclusively under the monarchy and controlled by the monarch with no any purpose of any people to say anything about that. So they willy-nilly allocate the resources of the wealth in the country. Mind you, this wealth doesn't come from nothing. It comes from the labor of the people who actually are underpaid, and sometimes some of them, even their pension is stolen by the monarch. So it's a system that ruthlessly imposes itself over the life of our people, influencing them and pushing them to massive poverty, but at the same time, expecting the same people to praise this same institution. It's a complicated endeavor, which we will then think, why are the people not breaking the ranks from it? But at the same time, it is supported by imperialism. It is supported by those who benefit from the wealth of the country, those who think Swaziland has a geopolitical proximity for their own interest. They then feel that such a system should be kept in place and running. And its own habits of lifestyle is the corruption and the complete suffocating of the economy to the monarchy and pressing the majority of the people into poverty. And worst of all, it makes the people to have got no say in the state affairs of the country, even in the affairs of the people themselves. That is why it is running a pseudo government where the monarch has got control of everything. For purposes of illustrating, what is supposed to be the House of the Parliament, the people who participate in Parliament are vetted by the chiefs in the chiefdoms. There are about 365 plus chiefdoms all over the country. These are the basis of the constituencies in the country. And they are all controlled by the chief, which is an extension of the monarch. The chiefs are appointed by the monarchy, and they act on behalf of the monarchy on the ground to make sure that the people are kept checked by the monarchy institution for the purposes of whatever they want to do, extracting of labor, but actually pushing the people away from economic livelihood. Those people are elected through the vetting process because the first condition of you to be there, you must have shown allegiance, paying allegiance to the monarchy. And the identity is actually to be part and parcel of the royal regiments. The condition of the royal regiments, which is Kubutega, means therefore that you must have played your whole life and your whole everything to the monarchy, to a point that you can surrender your children, surrender anything for the monarchy for the purpose of livelihood. So these are the whole people who gang around the monarchy. They've made that pledge and they're isolated from the people to do that kind of purposes. And once they are in the parliament, the puppet government actually has got no purposes. It only can discuss nothing against the monarch, can discuss anything that reflects to the interests of the monarch. So it's a blend of a political system that serves the monarchy without the people. And then there's also the upper house of Senate, where there are about 30 members. Out of the 30 members, they are elected, they're appointed by the king. So any legislation of transformation that can change will be vetted and be decided by this House of Senate. And that House of Senate will make sure that there's no purpose of anything that is against the monarchy or that is actually contrary to the monarch interest can pass as a law of the country. And all he appoints the judges, he runs the security. Everything's in control of the monarch. He runs the government, he appoints the prime minister, and the prime minister work and act under the instruction of the monarch. So this is the kind of system that has actually, through its own existence, it has pushed our people to the condition where they are. Swaziland is amongst the poorest people in the world. Over 70% of the population lives below poverty line. And of this majority, about 80% of them live on food aid. Their food is being donated. On the other side, the monarch is among the richest monarchs in Africa. I think the top richest monarch, owning about 2 jets, private jets on his own, and running about over 15 palaces. Most of all, they also have got investment outside the country for themselves and for the monarch. Some of the assets are being held in the royal house in Britain for the royal family. So all those are the conditions at which the monarch can actually control and run itself. It's a system whose purpose is to make sure that the wealth and resources of the country are controlled by the monarchy. And the people of the country are either isolated or they work as slaves and paraded as pawns to the monarchy for the world actually to accept that there's a system of unique in culture whereby subjugated population of the country. And that's why you will find that HIV/AIDS is massive in our country. In what way? In the sense that the role of women, they've got independent, they are not dependent. They are subjected to the conditions of how the monarch is. They must be loyal to the manhood lifestyle. So that is why you can see this magnitude of lead. Apart that AIDS can be treated, in Swaziland there is no treatment because it is a cause. Unless the monarchy can have the proximity to control those medication, it can therefore find space. That's why hospitals in Swaziland are actually dry and out of basic medication, even bandages and Panadols, they are not there. But the monarchy runs its own private hospitals that is well furnished and they've got anything about itself. So it's a monarch that does everything for the people. And it also makes education extremely expensive to impoverish the people. People are forced to pay high education fees to make sure that they keep in poverty. And as William said, all human activity, every labor power of the people on the ground must translate into the accumulation of wealth to the monarchy. That's why even today, women are mobilized to go and cut grass from the field so that they can present that grass to the monarchy. When this grass is for thatching, it is actually a product in one or another that we think, and in our own communities, rural communities, people do that to make their livelihood. But they are told that because they've got no control over the land, the grass is growing in the land. So the owner of the land will demand that grass. And the people, through forced labor, must cut the grass and present it to the monarch at their own cost. So I think that is the kind of the situation. That is how the monarch is. That's why our population for over 30 years has not been growing. People, even though they are live births, but the population cannot grow. The reason is actually not because of immigration. The reason is that people die of very much serious frustration. It's either stress-related death or also it is diseases, curable diseases. And in the main, it is because the system completely neglects the people. And as you see the situation now, the monarchy sees the people as useless and now think that it can gamble over the land. That's why it's massive evictions and people are taking over land from other countries that are coming there to buy the Swaziland so that the monarchy can use every asset of the country for its own accumulation. So I think that is a system that is a dynasty. It's a system that must not be emulated. It doesn't preserve the culture and it's got no purpose of livelihood. That is why there is a movement in the party like ours and the movement in the country that is struggling to make sure that things are changed, like our country gets into pain. But they're struggling also get into major complications because their interests that are existing from foreign forces within Swaziland are also growing in the same way that our population are growing. The interests of our people grow for their freedom. So we are competing over what our country should provide. Our country must provide what is good for the people of the country. But the monarchy actually says the country must progress and move on to provide whoever have a hand to support the growth of the monarchy and whoever want to ensure that there is much extraction of the wealth in the country. And that is the context of the patterns of lifestyle. And who will win at the end? We believe that even it can take long, but our people must eventually win because we are in the course of history. We're on the right side of how things should be done in the country. So they must be free, must enjoy a freedom whereby women and every individual society should actually take the destiny of their own lives. I think that is the purpose and the pattern at which there is a cause of struggle that should be waged ruthlessly as it demands because the system becomes each and every moment very aggressive and very intolerant to any dissent, and it is putting people into prisons, and it is actually killing people who start to challenge the system. But that does not mean that there can be no solution. Solution must be forged even in the complicated situation as it is. We demand for the abolishment of the monarchy and the setting up of a proper democracy in Swaziland, where the people of the country will have the right to determine their own destination. We want an end of every form of cultural manipulation in the country, and that can be done only when the people have achieved and win their freedom. I think that is the key point of the determination, and we call upon solidarity and support from the people of the world who actually appreciate and support the cause of the people, who feel and think that the people of Swaziland also have got a right. That's part of the land of the world also deserve actually to make a meaningful contribution. We believe, therefore, that the current situation in the country, our country is misrepresented in the world, and our people are misrepresented in society in general. So there's a need for a proper government, for a proper system. And that can be done only when we have overturned the monarchy and abolishing it and put in place a pervasive democracy that will make our people to define and create the way forward and reserve and change and turn around almost all these miseries of our people and turn our country to be a fortune of life for our population.
Next to South Africa, where the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa is celebrating a labor victory. The outcome is being seen as another reminder of role organized workers continue to play in defending fair wages, decent working conditions, and social justice across the continent. Let's hear what they have to say.
No, okay. Let me start from here now. So on the 17th of February, there was a fatality at the mine, whereby 5 people were trapped underground. 5 employees were trapped underground, whereby they lost their lives, unfortunately, after that. So within that process, when there was still search and rescue underground, and that's when the company decided to approach the court to say that they want to go into liquidation, whilst that process was still ongoing. And then in their papers, when they were applying for liquidation, they stated that the mine was not doing financially well. And we then scrutinized their papers as NUMSA, and then went to realize that actually there's no need for the company to go liquidation as per their papers. And we then realized that there is a prospect of liquidation, sort of business rescue that can happen. Then we as NUMSA engaged with the employees themselves. The employees, they have experience in the mine. They know how the mine works, and then they know the operations. And we then formulated a business rescue plan with the assistance of the business rescue practitioners and as well as the workers themselves. And then we came up with a business rescue strategy or business rescue plan that we submitted with our application to the court, to show the court that yes, the company is saying that there's liquidation, they are financially distressed, but this is our turnaround strategy that we believe that with correct funding, it might work for the benefit of the employees themselves, the community, and also the other stakeholders, including the owners of the mine as well. Making time for us to meet and talk about the victory of NUMSA or the ruling. I think firstly, the ruling itself or the judgment, it's very significant because it reaffirms the important principles of South African law, where the court said that, or where a reasonable prospect of rescuing a financially distressed company, a business rescue should be preferred over liquidation. The reason why is because with business rescue, there's still a prospect of the company being rescued if it's financially distressed, with the work of the business rescue practitioners and other investments that can be made in the company. I think it's very significant in a sense that it's not every day that you find a union going to court and saying to court that actually liquidation it's not a preference at this point. Why shouldn't we try a business rescue first and see how it goes? Usually, with trade unions, we are passive observers in these processes, whereby we'll just observe the process and just file documents on behalf of employees and not do anything with the process. But with this one, it's significant and it sets a precedence that we should not be, as trade unions, be passive or passive observers when employers are faced with financial distress. As a recognized representative of workers, us as a union have to have a standing approach to approach courts to invoke business rescue provisions in terms of the Companies Act of South Africa. So this shows it's an example, more especially within the South African legal system and the broader significance that the broader significance in the ruling to say that the voices of the workers must be heard at all times. So it's very significant for South Africa and the continent as a whole to say that employers must not see unions or see workers as passive observers in such processes. I think the first lesson that is that workers must be treated as stakeholders in the companies, not as casualties, not as that balance, not as that thing that you can just remove from the balance sheet. They must be treated as stakeholders in a sense that they are involved in the processes, more especially when it comes to liquidation and other issues, to say that there must be a meaningful consultation that happens prior to the company deciding to close or restructure. Also, secondly, the government should ensure that their legal frameworks encourages corporates to prefer business rescue before liquidation. At times, you might find that the company is facing liquidation, but however, with meaningful consultations with the workers themselves, the company can gather a strategy that can turn around the finances of the company. So it is prudent and important that the workers or the unions are involved in such processes, and they form part and they are stakeholders, not casualties. NUMSA believes that Africa's mineral wealth must become a catalyst for industrial development, sustainable employment, and shared prosperity rather than a simple generating profit for the few. So what we're trying to say is that the minerals, there must be a catalyst between the poor and the government. So in a sense that the minerals that are produced in Africa, they must be for the Africans. They must ensure that poverty is taken away from the communities. For example, with the Ikapa matter, if you're following the story, with Ikapa matter, Kimberley is one of the oldest diamond mining operations in Africa. Actually, it's if not the first one. So it was important that when before the judgment there was liquidation, people had lost all hope, and this is a community that believes or they get most of their funding, or they get most of their salaries from these mines. So without these mines, there is no community. So it's very important that it be known that these mining operations, they serve as a catalyst between being poor and also having decent jobs in Africa as a whole. Then in court, the judge actually agreed with us to say that, yes, I agree. Prior to any liquidation process, the point of departure for any company is to start with business rescue first, instead of going straight into liquidation. And this business rescue, it's going to be there to save employment of the community itself and the workers.
Today's word is Afrobeat. Afrobeat is a music genre created by Nigerian legend Fela Kuti, blending African rhythms with jazz, funk, and high life. More than music, Afrobeat became a powerful voice against injustice, corruption, and inequality, giving the ordinary people a language of resistance through acts.
Hello everyone, I am Fauzia Zila Seidu and welcome to another edition of Word of the Day on Africa Speaks. Did you know that there's a difference between Afrobeat and Afrobeats? Well, I've got you covered. Today's word is Afrobeat without an S. Whilst today modern Afrobeats with an S dominate global pop charts, the original Afrobeat was born not as mainstream entertainment, but as a weapon of political defiance. Forged in the late 1960s amidst post-colonial turmoil, Afrobeat was co-created by Nigerian cultural icon Fela Kuti and legendary drummer Tony Allen, along with their band Africa 70. They fused West African highlife, Yoruba rhythms, funk and jazz into explosive sound impossible to not move to. But Afrobeat was never just music. Fela called it the weapon of the future. Fela showed us through Afrobeat that music can entertain while also educating, questioning, and inspiring systematic change. His legacy reminds us that artists are not just performers. They can also be the conscience of society. Beyond Fela, Afrobeat grew into a broader movement of pan-African resistance and anti-imperialism through music. Ebo Taylor in Ghana blended Afrobeat with high life to confront social corruption and Western exploitation. Orlando Julius in Nigeria helped build Afrobeat's foundation using rhythm to preserve indigenous identity against cultural imperialism. Musical pioneers like Dele Sosimi and modern groups like Kokoroko continue to extend Afrobeat's anti-establishment DNA globally. Afrobeat was engineered to awaken the public, hold power accountable, and demand liberation. Decades later, artists like Nigerian Burna Boy sample Afrobeat's archive to address state violence with songs like Collateral Damage or Another Story standing out. Young protesters during Nigeria's End SARS movement even marched to Fela's original tracks, proving Afrobeat's message remained timeless and urgently relevant. Modern Afrobeat with an S showcases African culture and creativity. Think of Afrobeat like large African markets. In one corner, you hear Ghanaian highlife. In another, Nigerian Afropop. Nearby are South Africans Amapiano, Congolese rhythms, and East African influences. Each has its own identity, yet together they create one vibrant marketplace that welcomes the world whilst remaining proudly African. Afrobeat, on the other hand, stands as the political conscience of the continent. It reminds us that cultural resistance through art can confront power and inspire real change. The success of both Afrobeat and Afrobeat raise important questions. Who owns Africans' music? Who benefits financially when African sounds dominate global charts? Are African artists, producers, and songwriters receiving fair rewards for their creativity? When music like Fela Kuti is sampled by artists today, does it lose its meaning in the race to become a commodity? These questions remind us that culture is not an expression of identity, it is also part of the economy. Because understanding words is the first step towards understanding the world. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep building a united Africa. Words are the ways in which we see and interact with the world. I am Fauzia Zila Seidu, and Afrobeat has been Word of the Day. See you same time next week.
We just heard about Afrobeat, and in our history segment, we remember its creator, Fela Kuti, whose death anniversary fell on August 2nd. Through his music, Fela challenged oppression, corruption and abuse of power, using Afrobeat to speak to the ordinary Africans. Nearly 3 decades after his passing, his voice continues to inspire those who believe that music can challenge power and awaken political consciousness.
On 2nd August 1997, Fela Anikulapo Kuti died in Lagos at the age of 58. What followed was something Nigeria's general had never managed in his lifetime. The city stopped. Hundreds of thousands filled Lagos for his funeral, with some estimates reaching 1 million. At Tafawa Balewa Square, his body lay in state before crowds followed the procession across the city to Ikeja. They were paying a final tribute to the man the state had spent decades trying to silence. Fela had built a new kind of music and turned it into a weapon. Afrobeat fused with Yoruba rhythm and high life with American funk and jazz. After a stay in the United States in 1969, where Sandra Isidore introduced him to Black Power politics and the writings of Malcolm X, Angela Davis, Stokely Carmichael, and Frantz Fanon, Fela aimed his music straight at power. He sang in Pidgin English, so working people across Nigeria and beyond could understand him. He named soldiers, corrupt politicians, multinationals, and the International Monetary Fund. He declared his Lagos compound an independent state, the Kalakuta Republic, beyond the reach of the Nigerian government. In 1976, Fela released Zombie, mocking the army as mindless men who only obeyed orders. The army answered on 18th February 1977. About 1,000 soldiers stormed Kalakuta, burned it down, beat residents, and raped women inside. They threw Fela's mother, Fumlayo Ransom Kuti, from an upper window. She was a pioneering anti-colonial organizer and a women's rights leader. She died from her injuries on 13th April 1978. Fela answered grief with confrontation. On the 30th of September 1979, he carried a symbolic coffin to Dodam Barracks, the seat of military power, under General Olusegun Obasanjo. He turned the state's violence into music through Coffin for Head of State and An Unknown Soldier, naming both the crime and the lie used to hide it. Fela made resistance impossible to censor because it was already a song people were singing. He formed the Movement of the People and tried to run for president in 1979, but the authorities refused his candidacy. In 1984, the military ruler Muhammadu Buhari jailed him on the currency charge after a trial that was clearly politically motivated and unfair. Fela was reportedly arrested around 200 times. He was beaten, jailed, harassed, and freed in 1986 after international pressure and a change of regime. He had dropped the name Ransom, calling it a slave name, and taking Anikulapo, the one who carries death, in his pouch. Fela's Pan-African politics also connected him to Thomas Sankara. In 1987, Sankara invited Fela to Burkina Faso, where the Nigerian rebel musician met one of the continent's inspirational revolutionary leaders. After Sankara was assassinated later that year, Fela honored him in underground system, naming him as the African leader who spoke of unity, truth, and liberation, while others served only themselves. Fela's legacy continues till today. The global Afrobeat that now fills stadiums carries his groove, even when it does not always carry his fight. In the Nigeria Fela sang about of stolen oil wealth, foreign debt, soldiers turned on their own people, and rulers protected from the poor, is the Nigeria that rose again in the End SARS revolt of 2020. Fela asked one question again and again, and it still has not been answered. Who does this country, this continent, actually belong to?
This is where we draw the curtains on this week's episode of Africa Speaks. From Mali to Congo, from the fight against hunger to the power of organized labor, tonight's episode reminds us that Africa's greatest strength has always been its people. So until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep standing for justice, dignity, and Africa unity. Because Africa must speak, Africa must be heard. I am Rashida Abubakar. I'll see you same time next week. Bye.